writing, but I have in here put whether it's a preacher, whether they're ordained, whether it's a clerk or a deacon, and I've shown that also to try to help a little bit as to who's writing these, and then I put what page it was on. Also, I was very industrious earlier before I got so busy, and I have typed out and annotated and edited the early minutes of Bulletsburg from 1795. February of 1795 is the first record we have. The first 7 months are lost. There's an original page up here that they brought. This is an original page from the minute book. And it's February. It tells about the Constitution, and this is February of 1795. So that is a piece of history right there. And they have the rest of the minutes leather bound and in a vault, which is probably where they ought to be in order to keep it. But these are all typed out, and sometimes I explain what they're talking about. Sometimes I have to put a question mark because I don't know exactly what they're saying. But this, it's 60-some pages. I was going to 1820 and I just wore out on it, so I stopped at 1812. But there, you can find out a lot of information in here. And it just shows what they were doing every month and who came and who went and all the different things like that. These early, when you begin looking at these early churches, the first thing you can say is they were identified by their doctrine. They all adhered to the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. The Philadelphia Confession of Faith is the one that Elkhorn Association adhered to. It's also one that's very similar to what the Columbia Baptist Church in 1790 across the river adhered to, though that church never had any association with the Northern Kentucky churches. That was the first church in Northwest Territory, what became Ohio. Later on, I found a history book over there of the Miami Valley Baptist, and the writer Dunleavy says it was because of the slave issue, and any church or anybody in the Northwest Territory could not have slaves. But they never told them that. They just said they didn't care to fellowship. And so they never mentioned that issue at all. But they adhered to the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. In 1833, the New Hampshire Confession of Faith was published, and some of the churches adopted that. Doctrinally speaking, they believed what was referred to as the doctrines of grace, or what many call Calvinism. It emphasized the sovereignty of God, especially in salvation. They talked about God being the author and finisher of salvation. And so that was their basic theological belief. And it was spelled out very clearly in the Philadelphia Confession of Faith. Actually, there is a Philadelphia Confession and a New Hampshire Confession in the back of this Baptist Encyclopedia. They believed in the authority of the local church. No ecclesiastical order had any higher authority than the local church. And they had no authority over them whatsoever. When they formed their association, they specified that the association would not have any authority or control over the local churches. They spelled out that they believed in baptism by immersion. They believed in close communion in that either members only, or some of them believed that Baptists only could participate in their communion, and this was tied to their view of discipline. And they did believe very strongly in discipline. You see this mentioned throughout the notes, and you know, a lot of people joke about it. The thing that they excluded people from the church for back then. The frontier was a wild and woolly place. And the word affray is mentioned quite often in the minute books. They had a lot of fights. And they would put people out of the church for having an affray with someone else if it could not be resolved. And I guess there's still a lot of fights today, and we're having one with this with these terrorists. But they admonished people, and that was always the first element of discipline, was to admonish. And then if the admonishment didn't bring the results, then they would go ahead and remove those who had violated the church moral or doctrinal standards. Now the blacks were disciplined also, and Sometimes you read of the blacks bringing charges against the blacks. And one thing that I thought was extremely interesting is that they would give the blacks just as much hearing as they would the whites. And they were just as patient with them. If someone said they couldn't come to the meeting, they would postpone that. And if a black could not come to the meeting for the charges, they would postpone that. And in one particular case, it was about 4 months that this woman, it was postponed because she was not able to come to the services. And so those things were all tied together. Those are spelled out very clearly in the Philadelphia Confession of Faith, and they adhered to that. Now, there's a big event that occurred here in Boone County. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was basically started in the 1740s in New England. And we hear the name Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and some others. It started in New England. It moved down into the middle Atlantic states. It was really a great event in the early history of our country. Well, there was a second awakening. And that awakening started in Kentucky on the frontier. The first report we have of it is down in Logan County, down in southwestern Kentucky. There is a Shaker settlement, Union Shaker, it's called Union something. But there's two of them, one in Harrodsburg, outside of Harrodsburg, and one down in Logan County. And the Shakers came from New York to see what was going on when this revival broke out down there in Logan County, and they ended up establishing a community down there. And it was the results of that awakening. Well, the awakening sort of moved towards central Kentucky, and then John Taylor tells us about it as it came to Boone County. And it really, in 1800 and in 1801, there was a real spiritual awakening in Boone County. He tells us that it first started down in Corn Creek, down in what's now Trimble County, but it was then Gallatin County. And he was down there, and they didn't have a church at that time, but he tells about the services that they had. And then when he came back up to Boone County, it was just sort of a spontaneous awakening that started here, and it lasted for about a year and a half. And Bulletsburg at that time, and that was the only church in this county at that time. And when Bulletsburg was started, it was the only church in northern Kentucky at that time. I think it was 1795 or 6 that the Mouth of Licking Baptist Church started. But that was the only church in this whole area. And so in 1800 and 1801, with this second awakening that started, it wasn't labeled that till much later, John Taylor tells about how it developed. And Bulletsburg was a very small church at the beginning of that revival. It had about 200 members at the end of 1801, so it was really a great ingathering. In 1803 then, Middle Creek Baptist Church was started, which is now Bellevue. So those were the first two churches here in this county. Two of the blacks that were very prominent in that revival was a man named Asa, and this was John Taylor's slave. He became a real powerful preacher. He went around with a man named Christopher Wilson. As Christopher Wilson went around the county and all of this area preaching, Asa went along with him. He trained Asa. Asa became a very effective black preacher, and actually they allowed him to hold services for the blacks, and they had their own services with him as the preacher. He had a sister named Letty, L-E-T-T-Y, and Letty was also John Taylor's slave. And as John Taylor tells about the different people that he came in contact with at Bulletsburg, he mentions Letty. Actually, he takes 3 pages of this book to describe Letty. And Jennifer Warner took that statement of John Taylor and put it in the Boone County history book. It's a very moving statement about her conversion, and John Taylor says that she was such a mean woman. He'd had her since a child. She was so mean. He said she was stronger than most men that he had as slaves. But then she was converted, and he said she was a dramatically different person. And so he has her words, and she tells about her experience and all, and then her baptism there in the Ohio River. And I mentioned that to Jennifer, that I was very pleased and impressed to see that in the book, and she said, well, I couldn't let that go. And then later on, I was reading about some slaves that were sold south, and there was a woman named Letty, and I was really upset when I read that. And I thought, oh me, did Letty get... One of the punishments for slaves was to sell them south. If they kept running across the river and they couldn't handle them, they would sell them south, and that was what everyone dreaded. And but I found out there was another Letty. It was not the same woman. John Taylor took her when he left, and so it was not the same woman. So that Letty was not sold south. But that didn't happen very often, but it did occasionally. The association, when it started, the North Bend Association, there were 9 churches, and they included Campbell, Boone, and Pendleton County. Kenton was not a county at that time. And actually, when Bulletsburg started, this was still a part of Campbell County. Absalom Graves, William Cave, some of these other men were elected officials in Campbell County, and later became officials in Boone County. When it was voted by the legislature in 1798, and then actually became functional in 1799. But those 3 counties, there was, I think, one church in Pendleton County that was associated there as well. They met at Dry Creek Baptist Church down near what is now called Dudley Road. And it was a cabin there, and then later there was an article in the paper a few years ago that Dry Creek moved over to Buttermilk Pike, and now it's a residence. The building's been preserved and rebuilt, and it's now a residence. But the Dry Creek Church is where they first met. Louis DeWeese was a man from Boone County. He became a preacher. He was ordained under John while John Taylor was here. John Taylor has a lot to say about him in the book. Later on, I found out Louis DeWeese moved across the river to Indiana. Louis DeWeese is one of those who freed his only slave. Her name was Phyllis. F-I-L-L-I-S is the way they spell it. And she later became a member, she was at Bulletsburg, she later became a member at San Run, and is listed there as a free black member. And so Louis DeWeese was in on it. William Cave was there when they started this association. There were a total of 429 members in all of these 9 churches at that time. And by 1825, there were 25 churches in this area and in this association, 1,656 members. Then in 1827, Campbell County established their own association. So they dismissed those churches to organize them. Then in 1831, 10 Mile Association down in the Gallatin County area established, and they dismissed 2 churches for that. Then, and we'll discuss this a little bit later, time's getting away, but when they had the big split here among the predestinarians in 1840, there were 6 churches that withdrew from the association. And they formed what was called the Salem Predestinarian Baptist Association. John Uriah Lloyd was sort of fascinated with the Predestinarian Baptists, and he writes a lot about them. Warwick on the Knob centers on that because the Forks of Gunpowder actually became a Predestinarian church from 1840 until it died out in the late 1890s. And it was reestablished as a missionary Baptist church shortly after the 20th century. I keep calling it this century. The 20th century, and then it again died out later in the 1930s. But in 1841, the North Bend Association only had 6 churches, and they were down to 611 members. But then, by the end of the century, there were over 3,000 members. So they did have some substantial growth. Now the Campbell County and North Bend Associations have merged in what is called the Northern Kentucky Baptist Association. Burlington, as I mentioned, had been associated with the Elkhorn Association, and The Elkhorn Association had slavery in those churches. Most of those churches, most of the people from central Kentucky back then had come from Virginia, and that was the pipeline. Most of the North Carolinians came over into Tennessee and then on west. Many who came into central Kentucky, and especially up here, went on to Missouri. As you remember, Daniel Boone came into Kentucky, went on to Missouri because it got too crowded here. But Robert E. Kirtley, who was Robert Kirtley's son, went to Missouri for a while and then came back here and pastored for a long period of time. Pastored San Run and Burlington Baptist Church. And slavery was in all of these churches back then. So it was brought up periodically, but usually the subject wasn't discussed. And I think it is a subject that you have to deal very gently with. When I handed out these handouts, I had another one that just went into more detail than that, and I thought, well, this would be the best one. It is shocking sometimes when we think back of earlier history. When you go back to the Middle Ages, and we heard the word crusade this week, and everybody got all upset about the word crusade. Well, there were 12 crusades back in the Middle Ages, beginning about the year 1000, and there was just horrific things that went on during those crusades. That shocks us when we read those things. Well, when we talk about slavery, it's very shocking to us. There was a professor at Moorhead, and I tried to remember his name this afternoon and I couldn't, but he has written a lot of articles that have been in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society. He talks about local slavery. Mason County, Boone, and Owen seem to have the most slavery in these northern counties of Kentucky. And those people were associated with Virginia ancestry, and that's why they have that connection. I mentioned Asa, but there was another black preacher. Robert E. Kirtley writes about him. His name was Barnabas. Sometimes he's mentioned as Barnaba without the S, but apparently he was a very effective preacher in the San Run area. And so Robert Kirtley is the only one that I have seen mention his name so far. In the church meetings, the slaves sat in the gallery. I remember the old Big Bone Baptist Church used to have a balcony, what we call a balcony. Well, back then that was called the gallery, and that's where the slaves sat, is in the upper section. And then after slavery, after the Civil War, then usually those were remodeled, and some of them were left in the buildings, the older buildings that stayed around. And so everybody sat up there. But that was the assigned place for slaves. When people were subscribed to help support the church, only free white males had to contribute. So the slaves were not expected to contribute anything financially at all. But I remember when they were having a discussion one time in Bulletsburg about putting backs to the seats, is the way they said it. They sat on benches with no backs to them. So it was a pretty big issue about putting backs to the seats. Well, only the seats in the white section got the backs put to them. And you know, when you think of that, we just have a different perspective of things than folks did back then. And it's kind of shocking to us when we read that. The times of the different constitutions: 1794 for Bulletsburg. For a short period of time there was a Wolpers Creek Baptist Church. 1801, it only lasted for 3 months. It seems to be over the location of a new building. John Taylor denies he has any idea what that was over, but I think he was the leader of that. He was the first one to withdraw from Bulletsburg and join the new church. And he became their stated preacher. But I need to quit talking so fast. Excuse me. After 3 months, they had an agreement that they would settle on a place to build the building, and then they would reunite, which they did. The only contingent was Wolper Creek said all of the records had to be preserved. So they are in the minutes of Bulletsburg Church, the whole 3 months life of Wolpers Creek. And but Absalom Graves and many other prominent members, more than half of the church, joined Wolpers Creek. So there was a pretty bad division over relocating the building. Excuse me. There was a Mud Lick Baptist Church that was down in the Beaver Lick area. It was established in 1804. It became a predestinarian church and died out in the late 1800s. There was the Forks of Gunpowder was established in 1812. It became predestinarian in 1840. Bethel Baptist Church on Mount Zion Road was about a mile from US 42. It became predestinarian in 1840. Sand Run was established in 1819. East Bend was established in 1820. There's probably less historical record for East Bend than any of the early churches that were established because a fire burnt down the clerk's house. And so all of the early minutes and the records were destroyed in that fire. They tried to write a history of the church in the 1870s, and the man assigned to write it said he couldn't find enough evidence to write a history of it. So any history we get of that church is always a later history because of that fire. And that happened quite often back then. Cold winter would come and they'd heat up the fireplace and then burn the house down. And the records went as well. Salem Baptist Church in Verona was established in 1826. This became a predestinarian church. And then Burlington was established in 1843. Big Bone was established in 1843. Some have said that Florence was established in 1844, but actually they're shown to join the association in 1855 with 11 members. So most of the churches were very small back then when they first started. And Florence was established out of the Dry Creek Baptist Church in what is now Kenton County. The War of 1812, some comments are in the circulars. We know that Robert Kirtley went off to war. He went up to Piqua Town, Ohio. I assume that Piqua